paintbrushes to camera lenses, creative women of Great Plains. This is all from the museum's permanent collection, and we have 50 works on view, all by women artists from the region. So if you haven't had a chance to look around before the lecture, please stay a little bit after and take a look. And thanks. I'm going to hand it back over to Kate.
Hello, welcome Facebook viewers. So the center, if you guys haven't been here before, this is a little bit of a different topic for us. So the center is an interdisciplinary research and outreach operation. And we do lots of work in the arts and the humanities, social science, natural sciences, but we don't do much having to do with sports on the Great Plains. In fact, maybe the last thing we did was our annual Great Plains Conference in 1998 titled Health and Lifestyle, Sport and Recreation on the Great Plains. So we're a little past due. That's why when Dr. Cody Havard reached out to me after publishing a piece in Great Plains Research titled University of Nebraska Student Views on the Iowa Hawkeyes and the Wisconsin Badgers, we were definitely on board to do this talk. Dr. Havard is an associate professor of sport commerce at the University of Memphis. He received his Ph.D. in sport administration from the University of Northern Colorado, a master's from Texas State University, San Marcos, and a bachelor's from the University of Texas at Austin. His primary line of research addresses rivalry in sport, and he's the developer of the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale, which measures fan perception toward their team's rival. He has published work on rivalry in journals such as Sport Management Review, the Journal of Sport Behavior, and the International Journal of Sport Management and Marketing. Cody has had work featured in popular culture books and newspapers and is internationally known for his work on the rivalry phenomenon. So his talk today is titled Us, Them, and We, Sport Rivalry in the Cornhusker State and Beyond. So please help me welcome Dr. Cody Havard.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Peter, also, he was kind of my introduction to the center through Great Plains Research. And so it was a great experience working with them and working with the journal, and then being able to come here and speak. Also, I want to thank everybody for giving me this opportunity, because it also lets me speak in front of my family so they get to see what I do for a living. Hopefully you like it. And so what I research is basically in-group and out-group, and what that means to be an in-group and an out-group. And that could be within sport, it could be outside of sport, as in politics or different ideologies. It could be if you are a Marvel, DC fan, anything like that. It's basically Group A versus Group B. And what are the psychological tenets that underline what cause us to want to compare favorably to another group. And so we'll start off with a little bit of a map of where we're going to go. Here are the 5 things that I'm going to focus on. Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, to talk about what actually brought me here, talking about the research and GPR. Then talk about why I research rivalry, so maybe give a little bit of background there. Why rivalry matters, what the impact of rivalry is, and then what's next, or what can we do about this. And so first, to start with the paper that ultimately led to me standing here today, Nebraska, Iowa, and Wisconsin. A few years ago, I worked with a colleague we did a survey for the National Association of Collegiate Marketing Administrators. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to know why college students go to games, why college students don't go to games, and things that could influence college students staying later or longer at games. And so it was a national survey that we worked with the collegiate marketing administrators at different universities to send out this survey. And so happened, we had the largest number of student or per school respondents from the University of Nebraska. Out of about 11,000 students who returned this survey from around the nation, we had about 700, close to 700 students from the University of Nebraska. So when we were pulling through some of that information, I looked at the University of Nebraska, and we had enough information there that we could start to parse out some information dealing with rivalry. Again, that Group A versus Group B. And so what we did as part of this is we asked students who their main rival was. And you see 437 students indicated the University of Iowa was the rival, while 99 students indicated the University of Wisconsin was their biggest rival. Keep in mind, these were students in the summer or the fall of 2016. Then the two next schools identified as rivals were Oklahoma and Texas. You can see both from the Big 12 days. And if you were to go back generationally, I imagine if we were doing this 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it would have been Texas or Oklahoma in the Big 12. If you would go back 20, 25, 30 years ago, it definitely would have been Oklahoma as who the biggest rival was. But since we had enough to statistically test the difference between Iowa and Wisconsin, we started to compare the responses to those schools. And so what we did is we asked people their perceptions of those schools. Things like, how prestigious do you think the university is? How excited do you get when you beat that university's athletics teams? How likely are you to support those universities' athletics teams against someone else? And then questions about behavior of the fans from the rival team. So what we found was people or students were more negative toward Iowa than they were Wisconsin on those four metrics. We also asked people, when these two schools, Iowa or Wisconsin, loses to someone other than Nebraska, so a third team, do you celebrate that, or how likely are you to celebrate that? It's something that some people refer to as schadenfreude. It's something that we refer to as glory out of reflected fire, which we'll get to here in just a bit. But here again, students were more likely to celebrate when Iowa lost than when Wisconsin lost. So there are a few things that come from this, if we're asking why this would occur. First, it's because proximity. Nebraska and Iowa being close to each other, the students having a greater likelihood of interacting with people from the state of Iowa than possibly the state of Wisconsin, which is a little bit further away, right? Also, if you look back at the history, Nebraska and Iowa have played more frequently than Nebraska and Wisconsin. So what was so interesting about this, and what's so interesting to me about Nebraska athletics in general, is conference realignment, which we'll touch on more in just a little bit. So that's really what led to, again, working with Peter in the journal, led to here. So now we'll get into why I research rivalry. So 2008, I was living in Colorado. If anyone remembers the 2008 season, the football season, Nebraska was still in the Big 12. I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin. So I am a lifelong Longhorn fan. My first trip to Lincoln was actually to watch the last game between Texas and Nebraska that was played here before Nebraska joined the Big Ten. So I'm a fan of Texas. We consider our biggest rival, most people consider our biggest rival to be Oklahoma. So if you remember that season, or you look back, we actually, when we played in the Red River rivalry that year, Texas beat Oklahoma by a score of 45-35. Later on that season, as you know, anybody remember Michael Crabtree? Anybody know who he is? He catches a pass with, I think, 6 seconds left, runs it in for a touchdown. Texas suffers its first loss of the season. Devastating, right? A week later or 2 weeks later, Oklahoma in turn beats Texas Tech. So it comes down to, at the end of the regular season, Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech are all tied for first place in the Big 12 South Championship. They have to decide who is going to play in the Big 12 Championship game. And it went to the, I believe, 5th or 6th tiebreaker that the Big 12 used, which was BCS points. Oklahoma barely beats out Texas in their BCS rankings that year, so they end up playing in the Big 12 Championship game, and they win the Big 12 Championship game. They end up going to the National Championship game and playing against the Florida Gators. Now, when I'm watching that game, I'm thinking, hey, I really want Florida to win. And aside from being a fan of Disney and Walt Disney World, I have no other ties to the state of Florida. As a matter of fact, I don't care if Florida were to win another game. I just wanted them to win the national championship game. I started thinking, why would that occur? So what would cause me to cheer against a rival? I started thinking about this and thinking/hoping that other people were feeling this way as well. I wasn't the only one. So that led to, this was my first year of pursuing my doctorate. It led to me conducting interviews with football and men's basketball fans, talking about their favorite teams and their relationships with their favorite teams and their rival teams. And this ultimately led to a description of sport rivalry and set me off on what I've researched for the past close to 10 years now. And so here's our definition of what a sport rival or what sport rivalry is. It's something that fluctuates over time, but there is the Group A and Group B, and Group B is adversarial in some manner. And those relationships are caused for a variety of issues. We have up here that gain significance through maybe on-field competition, on-field or off-field instances. Proximity, so how close they are together. The demographics of the places where those schools are located, and or historical occurrences. For instance, the Red River rivalry between Texas and Oklahoma used to be called the Red River Shootout. The reason it was called the Red River Shootout is at the turn of the 19th century, there actually was a land dispute on the Red River to determine Texas believed that their land went into what is currently now Oklahoma. Oklahoma believed their land went into what is currently now Texas. There was a standoff on the Red River. National Guard was called in. Luckily, no shots were fired. But from that has kind of been used to build this antipathy between the two schools. Another thing that those interviews led to was glory out of reflective failure, which I alluded to earlier. And basically, this is someone gaining pleasure when their rival loses or suffers some type of indirect failure. So why do we do that? One, it makes us feel better about ourselves. Because when our favorite teams win, we feel good. And that carries over to us. It illuminates to us. When our rival teams lose, we also feel good. Because it makes us feel better because our favorite team did not suffer that loss. It also makes the favorite team look better because we can, as fans, say we would never lose on that stage. If we were playing in the national championship game, we would never lose on that stage, right? Then, by using that, also, when the team looks better, it also reflects more positively on us. And ultimately, what it leads to, or what rivalry is the study of how individuals and groups interact. Okay? For the dissertation, I started looking into how can we quantitatively measure what sport rivalry means to people. Believe it or not, there was not a lot of academic research on what sport rivalry was. People would use rivalry in the sport context as an independent variable for something, but there wasn't a lot of research on it. And so I was having to look in areas as far as military warfare and international relations and things like this to determine what this was. And so, a stroke of good luck, maybe, it led to us having to develop our own scale. So that was the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale. And where we ask people, indirect competition is how likely are you to celebrate, or how likely are you to support the rival against someone else. Prestige is how prestigious do you think the university is where your rival team plays. Or if we're talking about a professional team, how prestigious do you think the city or the region where they play is. Out-group sportsmanship, so the behavior of rival fans, because typically as sport fans, we feel like our fans behave wonderfully. Our fans never do anything. Rival fans are the ones causing the trouble. If there's something that goes on, it's because a rival fan did it, and we're just reacting to it, right? And then sense of satisfaction, how happy are we when we defeat our outgroup? So next, moving on to why rivalry matters. First, we'll touch briefly on fan identification and behavior. And so basically, when you identify with a group, in this instance, when you identify with a team, it has many positive attributes or positive characteristics for you. One, it can decrease the feeling of loneliness, make you feel part of a group. However, as fans, we also experience the wins and the losses and off-field incidences of our favorite teams. So, basking in reflective glory is basically when a team wins, we want to associate with them, okay? Because that reflects positively on us. Cutting off reflective failure is when a team experiences some type of failure, we push away from it. We push away from it because we don't want to feel the pain of that team's loss. We don't want them reflecting negatively on us. And then there are also a few other things that people talked about where you can even bask in spite of reflective failure. So if a team is unsuccessful for a long period of time, it actually becomes a badge of honor. The Chicago Cubs fan base experienced this for a long time. The Houston Astros fan base experienced this for a long time. People can also cut off reflected success. So if there's something that they don't agree with, they can actually push away from a favorite team, even if that favorite team is successful. And then some people, highly identified people with teams, deal with losses by either blasting or scapegoating. So blasting would be finding some way to derogate or put down the rival team. We didn't win this contest, but it was the ref's fault. Or because they cheated. Or did you see that fourth down or that fifth down they got? They should have gotten that in the game. Or we can scapegoat against our own in-group members. So we didn't win because someone in our in-group actually messed up. But it's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. These are all ways to either make ourselves feel good by bringing in the success and protect ourselves by pushing out failure. That leads to in-group bias. And what is in-group bias? Basically, people show a bias or favoritism toward people that are members of their group. And this affects many different things. It can affect the way we describe people. Rivalry can affect the way we prepare. So a positive thing from rivalry is we can increase our preparedness or increase our effort when we're preparing for an activity. But it can also bring out negative behavior, like making people more likely to do unethical things. To get that competitive advantage, we may cut corners here and there that we wouldn't otherwise have done. Rivalry also increases consumption likelihood, so you're more likely to go to a game if your favorite team is playing a rival. You're more likely to pay higher price premiums or ticket prices for that. Wear merchandise of your favorite team. Watch on television. Okay. It also impacts the way we describe behaviors of fans and even behaviors and output and effort of participants. So there's one study in particular where people were shown a video of a Division II athlete, a Division II basketball athlete in a practice, and just running drills here and there. And each group was told this was actually a high school athlete that was either committing to their favorite school, or some people were told this was a high school athlete that had committed to their rival school. The people who believed the athlete had competed or was coming to their favorite school thought they were going to be a great asset. They were going to help the team. They were going to turn around the team. It was going to be a great season the next season. People who were told that athlete had committed to the rival school, they started downplaying their performance and their effort. Oh, they're going to turn out to be a bust. They're not that good. They're overrated. Things like that. So it even affects the way that we describe behaviors and output of someone else, just based on the groups that we're a member of. And then, rivalry also influences us to enjoy an out-group's failure, either in direct competition when our favorite team beats our rival team, or in indirect competition, which what I talked about with Gloria, reflective failure, and schadenfreude. So, to keep going with why rivalry matters. A few things that we've been able to do is we have a website, sportrivalry.com, that has been really fun. It started out as a website that literally had Excel sheets on it, looking at, here is Texas' record against every other school in the Big 12. Here is Nebraska's record against every other school in the Big 12 and now the Big 10. It's evolved into what it is now, where we have a lot more input on it, we have a lot more content on it, and something that's really cool is I've been able to use it with my students and with my classes. So this has also provided somewhat of real-world opportunity for students to work on a website and to create content for them. So for instance, the student involvement, I have students that after rigorous approval, they actually have control over the Sport Rivalry and Sport Rivalry Man Twitter account. They don't have control over mine and over the Facebook page, but they are able to post content to that. And what that means is on a weekly basis, when we're in college football season or there's a big rivalry game coming up, they're posting about, here's the history of this rivalry. Who are you rooting for? That type of thing. So it gives them the opportunity in a safe setting to experience what it is to be in charge of an organizational account. If they do something they shouldn't do on there, then they talk to me about it and we're able to correct it. It gives them the experience to do that before they get out and they get a job with an organization and they do something they shouldn't, and all of a sudden, instead of talking to Dr. Havard about it, they're fired or demoted for something that they've done. It also has allowed us the last 2 years to create podcasts, This Week in Rivalry podcast. And there's 2 seasons now. The first season in my marketing class, I had students create a long-form audio podcast. So that was looking at the upcoming games that weekend and the history of those games, some of the fan interactions within those games, and then they, at the end, would give their predictions. The second year that we tried this last fall, we tried something a little bit different. We tried video blogs instead. We got a little bit more traffic using this, so we started having the students just do 1 to 2 minute videos about somewhat of the history, but it was more who they thought was going to win the game. And people were interested in that. Again, giving the students the opportunity to do something like this in a safe setting. We also have relevant research on the page, and then something I'll talk about a little bit later, we have educational comics and cartoons, and an educational curriculum about rivalry. So the 3 that I have up here, I know you can't see it, but those are Nebraska, the histories of Nebraska, Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and then we have Nebraska, Oklahoma up there. And so these were our first attempt to tell the historical stories of these rivalries. And why is it so important? What's unique about these rivalries? So we would focus on things that, when did it start? What was the overall record at the time the comic was made? What were 2 or 3 significant games or occurrences, incidences that led to kind of this heightened feeling of rivalry? And then the very last pane right here, we tried to sneak in some education into it. So we would talk about, some definition or phenomenon that deals with rivalry that hopefully tells people, hey, here's why you feel this way toward this white group. A couple other things on the website that I thought were pretty interesting to show here. We had enough data about 3 or 4 years ago that we just started to compile some fun comparisons and something that we could use in class to look at. And so the first thing that we did is, from all the data we had, I always asked fans who your biggest rival is, or who do you consider your rival? One fan saying, I consider Team A a rival, is one hit on here, essentially. Okay? So basically what this chart tells you is, out of 2,500 data points, when Syracuse fans were asked, who is your rival, they named 11 different schools. Nebraska named 9 different schools, and we can keep going down. But if you look at, what's interesting, you look at Syracuse, Nebraska, and West Virginia, well, they all have something in common, don't they? They're all in new conferences now. Look at Nebraska in particular. About almost half and half. They named 4 schools from the Big 12, 5 schools from the Big 10 that were going to be who they considered to be their biggest rival. So from a practical perspective, what we can look at is if you're a marketer and your team changes conferences or in some way changes a competitive setting, well, you have to expect that people are going to hold on to those old allegiances and old rivalries, and some people will start to maybe advance and move up. Which brings it back to why it's so interesting, the work we did with the UNL students 2 years ago, and seeing who they consider their rival to be now. And overwhelmingly, it was Iowa, then Wisconsin, and then you get into those Big 12 days and Big 8 days. We also looked at conferences and just took an average of conferences. So we had 10 teams in the Big 12 that we were able to get data from, 13 in the Big 10, and so on. And you can look at the average number of teams or average number of rivals per team. And so actually, people typically think of the Big 10 as the rivalry conference, right? Because there's all these rivalry trophies that teams play for. However, the Big 12 actually was a little bit higher on that. Another thing we did, we flipped around that question of who is your biggest rival, and we compiled data looking at how many different teams or fans of different teams name your team as a rival. So you see, Texas was named by 11 different schools. Texas A&M, Houston, and Nebraska no longer in the conference. Teams like, Houston is up there. So what this says as a marketer is, if we talk about the number of people or the number of brands that compare themselves to you is in some way says something about the strength of your brand, then this looks really good for the schools or the brands on this list, right? When you look at Duke, and they have a few ACC teams in there, but you also have Arizona, Kentucky, Connecticut. Well, what is similar from those schools and Duke? What sport would you kind of attribute to their success? They're really good at basketball, right? So they have a few of those basketball schools across the country that want to compare against them. And then finally what we did with some of the data is we took an aggregate score using the Sport Rivalry Fan Perception Scale. You can score from a 12 to an 84 on there. We took the aggregate score per individual toward different rivals, and we combined those to essentially come up with a rivalry score or an intensity score. So what this means is Arizona State, their aggregate score is a 64.24. So that means Arizona fans felt negatively or strongly toward Arizona State fans. Arizona State fans felt the same way toward Arizona fans. You can see we just ranked the top 25 here. Arizona State is number 1. A lot of people don't expect that. However, this is the 3rd metric that has found Arizona State to be that top fan rivalry. What does that mean? Those fans of Arizona and Arizona State really want to compare favorably to each other. Okay? Now, a broader perspective of that, or kind of a broader phenomenon with Arizona State, is they also get confused often. On a national landscape, a lot of people confuse Arizona with Arizona State. Oh, we're playing the Arizona State Wildcats. I mean, the Sun Devils. Confusion even to the point where organizations like the NFL, the NCAA have sent trophies to the wrong school because of that confusion. So it's kind of this weird, there's an in group and an out group if you're Arizona State fans, but on a national level, you're almost an in group, a larger in group, because you want people to give you respect, right? So if we look at the rest of this list, you can actually see number 2 was Nebraska and Colorado. Now, A lot of this data was taken before Nebraska and Colorado left conferences and kind of after those decisions were made to leave the conferences. So Colorado fans were really focused toward Nebraska. Nebraska had started to focus toward other schools. But I've highlighted, or I've bolded, the schools in the Big Ten, again, because Big Ten is usually considered the conference, or the rivalry conference, just to show kind of how those comparisons look. Now, what does all this mean? Well, when you're promoting rivalry, obviously, on a team perspective, or on a team level, we can promote rivalry games, right? We do that through t-shirts, television, internet, the ads we run. We can also promote when our rival is playing another team. This is something that teams can do and conferences also can do. Can you imagine having something like a watch party to watch your rival play a game? Does it matter if they win or lose? People there probably hope they lose, right? To the conference, to the television network, does it matter? No, because it's all revenue. Anything that gets people to watch those games is important to the conference, important to television networks. Another thing that started up in the last probably 15 to 20 years are what they call Rivalry Series. These are attempts to promote all of the sports within athletic departments. So not just the revenue sports of typically what are football and men's basketball, occasionally women's basketball and baseball. They essentially set up a year-long series where every time those two schools play, the winner gets a point. Or if you're playing in 2 times a year, like in basketball and volleyball, maybe you get a half a point. If you're playing in baseball or softball where you play 3 times a year, it's the winner of that series would get a point. What this does at the end of the year, it keeps people interested throughout the year. At the end of the year, they can compare whose athletics department performed better head-to-head than the other team. Okay? So it's something that has been successful for some, not as successful for other schools, but an attempt to keep people interested year-round in those, what we would refer to as non-revenue or Olympic sports as well. And then it also lets us look at new rivalries and creating new rivalries. And this in particular comes up because conference realignment. So something interesting happened on the way to the dissertation for me. Conference realignment started kicking off, and it went crazy. And man, did it go crazy. And who did it start with? It started with Colorado. Okay, Colorado said they're leaving the Big Ten, or the Big 12. They're going to what then was the Pac-10. Boise State followed suit to leave their conference. Nebraska then says, we're going to leave the Big 12. We're going to go to the Big 10. We got accepted there. Utah joins what was the Pac-10 to make it the Pac-12. You have a plethora of other schools start jumping on board. Brigham Young goes independent. Texas State and Texas San Antonio. Texas Christian, TCU, first leaves the Mountain West to go to the Big East. Then before even playing a game, they leave the Big East to go to the Big 12. Hawaii changes. Pittsburgh and Syracuse join the ACC. Texas A&M is the third school to say we're leaving the Big 12. West Virginia then is accepted into the Big 12. Missouri says we're leaving the Big 12 as well. And then Memphis, the school that I'm currently at, finally gets into one of the premier conferences. We're a Big East school right now. What happens to the Big East football schools? Big East basketball schools essentially leave, they take the name with them, right? So now, this looks a little crazy, doesn't it? We're not done. From 2010 to 2013, over 40 schools, there's 45 schools on this list. Over 40 schools changed athletic conferences in that 3-year period, that 4-year period. What does that mean? That means that every school had their competitive relationships fundamentally changed. For instance, obviously you have Nebraska, they're joining a new conference. So they're leaving behind all of the Big 12 schools. They have to find schools in the Big 10 to compare against. Why do we want to compare against new schools? One, on an individual level, we want to feel better about ourselves, right? Why do we want to do it for an organization? We want to sell tickets. We want interest in those games. But even the schools that stayed in their conference, the University of Texas, they didn't leave the conference. However, Texas A&M leaves. They were a primary or secondary rival. Nebraska leaves. So you have to find new teams to replace these. So what we started doing, once schools started saying they were joining other conferences, is we started asking people who their current rival was, who they believe the rival in their new conference would be. And we started looking at the perceptions toward those rival schools. We also started asking questions about how likely a person would be to commit anonymous aggressive acts, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more depth. But what we found was, at that time, before conference realignment, or before the teams had started playing in a new conference, people were more negative toward their current rival, the one they have all the history with, than the anticipated rival. Well, that makes sense, right? Because it's anticipated. Also, once you start, there's a honeymoon period, things like that. There was even a commercial from Texas A&M of Texas A&M students doing all the other chants from SEC schools. So it's things like that. We revisited this question after the schools had played in the conferences 3 or 4 years. What we found then was fans were actually more negative toward their current rival on things like fan behavior and prestige. So those things that occur off the field or out of competition, the competitive arena. However, in direct competition, people were still more negative toward their former rival. So a Texas A&M fan still would get more satisfaction from beating the Texas Longhorns. They still were less likely to support Texas play against a third team than they would be an LSU. And so what we did with that and the practical implication of that is, again, if you're a marketer, you have to expect, is it 3 years before your fan base kind of catches up with the moves that you're making? Is it 5 years? Is it 6 years? This is something that we'll be able to continue doing on a periodical level until we find, is there a point where all Texas A&M fans have sort of switched and they're more focused on LSU now than they are toward Texas? Then we can kind of give some guidance as far as what to expect. So to keep going with, or from an organizational perspective, we'll talk about impact of rivalry. Okay? So as a sport practitioner, and I started looking at rivalry from a marketing perspective and still do in many ways. I've started to look at it a little bit different in the last few years as well. But from a marketing perspective, what do we want? Well, when we think of our sport and entertainment options, and we think of people coming in, here's what we desire. We want people having a good time, right? We want people having cotton candy, ice cream. Basically, we want it all sun and roses, right? We want people having a good time. We want people there. We want people spending money for us. Why do we want this? Because we want an engaged crowd. And we want to sell a lot of stuff, all right? Basically, we want it to be the happiest place in the world, right? Now, in reality, what we're facing, especially now within the sport industry, is this. People either not coming to games, or if they're at their games, they're on their phones the whole time. And so much so that arenas and facilities have had to really increase their bandwidth and increase their access to giving people Wi-Fi and other amenities. Now, what causes people to possibly look up from their mini computers? Overruling fans. So fans these people are about to jump a fence. Fans behaving deviantly. Something like that. That's not good. That's definitely not good. That's on the second story, by the way. So when you see things like that, one, it can cause people to pay attention. It causes people to possibly have those associations with your sport organization as well, or your sport product. Then we go away from the playing field. Anybody know who this is? Who is this?
He was in the tree on Auburn. That was him.
Harvey Updyke. Harvey Updyke, following the Auburn's 2010 national championship victory over Oregon, they have what they call Toomer's trees. Basically, Toomer's drugstore is in downtown Auburn, Alabama. There are historic oak trees around it that when something good happens to Auburn, people would go and they would celebrate and they would throw toilet paper in the tree. They call it rolling the trees. Okay? They would do that when Auburn does something good. They also, admittedly, would do it when something negative happened to Alabama as well. So 2 weeks after, it's about 3 weeks after the championship game, Harvey Updyke calls into the Paul Feinbaum show. Some of you may know Paul Feinbaum now is on ESPN, but he used to have a radio show based out of Alabama. So Harvey Updyke calls into that show and he says, you know what, Alabama or Auburn fans rolled Toomer's Corners trees when Bear Bryant died, so they deserve this. You know what I did? I went and I poisoned those trees. He poisoned trees that were meaningful to this group. And yes, he did serve prison time for it. So you have these on-field incidences, you have these off-field incidences that can come from when rivalry is taken too far. So based on that, we started looking at what are the negative aspects of rivalry. And this is where I say, I look at it from a marketing perspective. I've sort of started looking at it from a responsible marketing perspective in the last 4 or 5 years. So it can lead to negative views of your rival teams and fans, the out-group. It can also lead to a decreased willingness to help somebody in an emergency situation. So this one, in this situation, participants went to a college campus and they went to a room and they watched a video of Manchester United or their favorite soccer club. Then they were told they needed to walk across campus and they were going to take a survey once they got across campus. As they were walking across campus, the researchers designed the experiment so that someone was riding by on a bicycle and they fell off the bicycle. So every participant saw this. The experiment was the person was on the bicycle was either wearing a shirt of the favorite team, a shirt of the rival team, or a shirt that did not affiliate with the sport of football or international soccer at all. Then once the participants got to the other room, they were told, they were debriefed, they didn't take a survey, they were told the purpose of, they were being observed on their walk over, they were dismissed. What the researchers found was people were more willing to help someone if they were wearing a football jersey or shirt than if they weren't wearing a football jersey or shirt. So there's a bit of in-group, out-group. They were also more likely to help that person who had fallen off the bike if they were wearing a shirt of their favorite team than if they were wearing a shirt of their rival team. So there, based on just simply the shirt that you're wearing or the team that you follow, people were less likely to help in emergency situations. Then, something I've been involved to a pretty good deal with is looking at willingness to consider anonymous aggressive acts. And so I mentioned this earlier with conference realignment, but here we would ask people a series of 9 questions. They were in 3 sets. Basically, if there was no way you could get in trouble, no one would find out, you wouldn't be arrested, no one would even think any differently of you, how likely would you be to, and then we would ask, either trip a player, coach, or fan of the rival team, break the leg of a player, coach, or fan of the rival team. The most heinous act, we asked, how likely would you be to inflict physical harm or even murder a player, coach, or fan of the rival team? Depending on who was asking the questions and the setting, people would alternate asking either murder or physical harm. This has been done 6 or 7 times now. Consistently. The good news is we found the vast majority of people would not consider these types of aggressive acts. But consistently, 1 to 2% have said they are definitely willing to consider the most heinous act of anonymous aggression. So that is physical harm or even considering murdering someone just based on the team that they follow. And again, if you take it out of sport, based on whatever group they are in. This has been done 6 or 7 times, as I said. When you do something 6 or 7 times in research, that's called reliability. We're getting at something that is very, very consistent. So, to take this forward, let's take the conservative figure of 1%. Okay? Out of 100 people, That means there's one person, right, that you have to be aware of. 1,000 people, there's 10 fans. We get up to 10,000 people, the size of a lot of arenas and facilities, that's 100 fans. If we get up to our largest facilities in the United States, 100,000 fans, you have to be aware that about 1,000 people would have at least said they would definitely be willing to consider those anonymous acts of aggression. That's pretty frightening from a social perspective. It's also frightening from an organizational perspective. So, what is our responsibility as marketers? What's our responsibility as researchers? Well, one, we want people to have a fun and safe atmosphere, right? We want people to take their family to games. It's a great experience. I'm sure many people in here have experienced it when you take your kid to a game. It's awesome taking them to games and introducing them to something new, right? We want people to have a fun and safe atmosphere. We want to increase excitement and keep fans very excited. That's why we promote rivalry the way we do in the United States. Unlike internationally, where a lot of times people try to kind of play down the rivalry aspect because they have had issues with fan deviance and fan violence. We try to play it up. At the same time, however, we want to diminish deviance and violence. So we want people to come up here on their excitement level, but we want to find that line where we don't want to cross. Because if someone crosses it, then that's bad on many, many levels. It's negative on many, many levels. So when something like this happens, why should we care as administrators and researchers? First, I think we can all say there's a moral obligation to make sure people are safe at your entertainment options, right? We want people to have fun. We want people to come back. We want people to feel safe to be there and just have a good time being there. However, even if you were to push that moral obligation aside, there's really 3 reasons why organizations should really care about something like this. One, there's the legal consequences. So, those 2 pictures. People in those pictures decide to sue. Who are they going after? Maybe they're going after the assailant or the person they're in a physical altercation with, but they're also going after the deep pockets. The deep pockets in that instance are the organizations, right? Organizations have been held vicariously liable for fights and altercations that have occurred on their premises. Brian Stowe, for example, being close to the end of his life following the San Francisco Giants-Los Angeles Dodgers game. The organization was held vicariously liable for that. So there's legal consequences as far as punitive damages and legal fees that you're spending. Also, dragging it out over a long period of time. There's a possible decrease in consumption because the longer it drags out, more people know about it. Another issue with this is, with decreasing consumption, let's say you're at this game and you see that, you may say, I don't really want to be in that situation again. Excuse me. If you've ever seen a physical confrontation, you remember, right? It makes you uncomfortable. You start to avoid places where you saw things like that, if that makes you uncomfortable, because you don't want to be there. So it could lead to this decrease in consumption. As people, we like to talk about marketing, the marketing escalator, and the goal of the marketing escalator is to get people to move up from new consumer to loyal consumer, but people can also move down that staircase or escalator, or they could just drop off completely and not consume the product. Now, there's also a possible loss in lifetime consumption. So building off that second point, let's say you take a 10-year-old child to a game. That's their first game they've gone to, really excited for it, and they witness that. And that's what they associate with sport. And they make the decision, I don't want to see that ever again. Maybe they never consume sport again in their life. They stay away from that altogether. Let's say that person lives to be 90. That's 80 years that an organization has possibly lost out on that person consuming their product, right? Taking it a step further, unfortunately, if something happens like this, you don't have your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man to help you out. But I think everybody recognizes a spider web, right? When we talk about spider webs and networking, we're talking about this center portion is the individual involved. Each one of these connections, where the twines connect together, that's a different contact point. So when we talk about networking and social networking, that really means that person in the middle, if you were to count all of those connections around that spider web, that's all the people they have contact with, that they have the possibility of sharing their negative views with. Word of mouth is still the most useful form of advertising. And especially if you read online, do people typically make positive comments, or are they making negative comments? We as a society typically choose to say more negative things about instances and about products, don't we? So you have the potential to lose out not only on that individual, but all individuals that person can talk to if they choose to tell that story. So we started looking at, all right, well, so what can we do about it? We know why we need to do something about it, but what can we do about it? And we started looking at the way we promote rivalries. And there are different titles and different logos that people use to promote rivalries. There's some that are more on the neutral side. You can see this is Iron Bowl from Auburn, Alabama. The Red River Showdown from the University of Colorado and Colorado State. The Red River Rivalry between Texas and Oklahoma, which I told you used to be called the Red River Shootout. Then they wanted to get away from the negative connotation of having guns, so they went to the Red River Classic. That wasn't good enough because people weren't as interested, so they went back to using the word rivalry. So now it's the Red River Rivalry. And then we have neutral, which could really be positive, the Heroes Game here at the University of Nebraska and Iowa. But we also have negative titles, like the Holy War between the University of Utah and Brigham Young University, which has religious ties to it. The Civil War between Oregon and Oregon State. The backyard brawl between Pittsburgh and West Virginia. The crosstown shootout between Cincinnati and Xavier. Actually, and I believe this was their logo from 2011, there was a fight at the end of that game between participants. So they went away from using crosstown shootout for a period of 2 or 3 seasons. They called it the Crosstown Classic. However, what happened? Interest dropped. They go back to calling it the Crosstown Shootout. So we started looking at and started wondering, how do the ways that we promote these contests and these relationships, how do they influence the way people behave, the way people feel toward the outward? So we devised a multi-year study where first we asked people, we asked students at the University of Memphis and Western Kentucky University, because both of those schools were changing athletic conferences. We first asked them, who do you think your biggest rival is going to be in, for Memphis, the AAC, for Western Kentucky, Conference USA. Memphis students said it was going to be Cincinnati. It was going to be their biggest rival. Western Kentucky students said it was going to be Middle Tennessee State. So once we figured that out, we went on to phase 2 of our experiment. And we came up with a list of 10 words that range from positive to negative. So words like friendly, game, contest, rivalry, all the way to things like battle, war, and hate. And we had a separate group of students indicate what they thought was the most positive, neutral, and negative words on those lists. What we found out was the most positive word association was the word friendly. The most neutral word on that list was actually the word rivalry. The most negative word on that list was the word hate. So then we went to the third phase of our experiment, and we designed the different we designed logos that appeared the same. Only difference was the wording in the logos. So, to use Memphis and Cincinnati as an example, we had the red and blue friendly. Some students saw the red and blue friendly when they took the survey and were asked about their perceptions toward their rival teams. Some students saw the red and blue rivalry. Other students saw 481 miles of hate, because that's the approximate distance between the cities of Memphis and Cincinnati. What we found was, when we asked those students their perceptions of the out-group, the students exposed to the negative title, so the title that involved or included the word hate, they were more negative toward the rival than people that were exposed to the word neutral or rival or the neutral title. All right. One interesting thing we found from this from a practical perspective also is we essentially had to throw out the friendly title. Because people in the United States are not used to having a game called a friendly unless it's an international friendly in soccer or football. So we found people exposed to hate, the word hate were more negative. We also found people exposed to the word rivalry actually showed greater what you would consider rivalrous behavior than people exposed to the word hate. So people who were exposed to the word rivalry were less likely to support their rival against someone else than someone who was exposed to the word hate. And if you think about it, if you are a fan of a team, you don't want your rival team to perform well, right? In many instances. Some you do, but in many instances you don't. So the practical implication from this was, if you use a word like hate, you may increase the animosity toward the outward, but you actually may be decreasing the actual feelings of rivalry between that outward. Because using the word rivalry, well, that reminds people that it's an important competition, right? This is a rivalry. We want to beat this team. Using the word hate maybe just tells them, well, we just want to hate these people. We just don't want to like them. I don't care what happens on the field. Whatever happens, we're not going to like them, right? A few other things that we did. We started looking at mediated stories. And especially now with the rapid spread of news and the rapid spread of news and social media, we started looking at short stories on how they would influence people's behaviors and perceptions. So first we looked at a rival indiscretion. So basically when a rival team or organization did something that was negative, how would people react? So we had three different variables or three different scenarios. First, there was a slightly negative indiscretion. So that's something like at the college level, recruiting violation, or at the professional level, player tampering, or something like that. Something that's not very, it happens, people get in trouble for it, but it's not in the grand scheme of things all that horrible, right? Then we had a moderately negative indiscretion, where there was a player who was arrested for a DUI, and they weren't sure if they were going to play in the next game or not. The very negative title or story was a felony with possible or proof of a possible cover-up. So when we were designing this, we were thinking about, well, things that, the revelations at Penn State had come out, the revelations at Baylor had come out. Shortly after we started this, revelations at Michigan State started coming out. And we thought, is there a point where you cannot celebrate something because it's just so negative, it's so bad? So we started looking into this. And sure enough, we found people that were exposed to the story about the felony indiscretion, well, they were more negative toward their rival team. So they wanted to beat their rival more. They got more excitement from beating the rival more. They were less likely to support the rival when they played someone else. Then those people exposed to either or evaluated the indiscretion as moderately negative or slightly negative. Okay. We also found, very interestingly, and what we anticipated was, people that believed the indiscretion was very negative. So for instance, those stories about the felony, they were less likely to celebrate a rival's indirect failure than people who evaluated the indiscretion as moderately negative or slightly negative. So that points toward maybe there is this kind of moral line that people don't want to cross. And ask yourself, can you really celebrate what happened at Baylor? Baylor getting in trouble. Like, if you feel good about Baylor getting in trouble, or you feel good about Penn State getting in trouble, does that in a way mean you're happy that those horrible occurrences happened? We can't go that far as individuals, right? So from a practical perspective, what we're able to tell administrators is, look, if you want to on your message boards talk about your team getting, or your rival team getting caught in a recruiting violation, okay. If you want to talk about a player making a mistake or a coach making a mistake, okay. But there is a line that if you cross this line, your fans may actually not reciprocate those feelings the way you want them to. They may not react the way you want them to, because there may be this moral line that people won't cross. The next thing we did is we looked at a story involving both the rival and the favorite team. So in this instance, we devised 3 different stories. Again, short, about 140 characters, so it would be something people would see on Twitter or a Facebook, short Facebook post. We devised 3 stories. One was a positive story. So the rival teams participated in a joint blood drive to support the community. There was a neutral story, so just a game preview. And then there was a negative story. So leading up to the rivalry game, fans of the rival teams got into a fight. Some people had to go to the hospital. Some people were arrested, things like that. Again, we asked people their perceptions of the out group, but we also asked people their perceptions and attitudes of the favorite team's brand as well. What we found was people exposed to the negative story of the fan fight, well, they were more negative toward the out group than those exposed to the positive story or the story about the blood drive. That makes sense, right? We also found they were more negative for the rival team and the favorite team. So what that meant is when somebody reads something about a fight between a favorite team and a rival team's fans, they not only have negative feelings toward the rival team, they actually have negative feelings toward the favorite team and the favorite team's brand. So where do we go from there? What do we tell administrators? Well, there's 3 main things we can tell them. I call it welcome to the friendly confines. But basically, using positive language to talk about competitors and to welcome people to stadiums. So this is from Wrigley Field. Welcome to the friendly confines of Wrigley Field. Now, does that mean every fan who enters Wrigley Field feels safe and feels great? No, right? Fans of the Chicago White Sox and fans of the St. Louis Cardinals, I'm sure can attest otherwise, right? But having that visibly or readily visible to people as they walk in does something. It puts people in a different atmosphere. It's not that antagonistic mood. It's more, hey, we're all baseball fans, or we're all sports fans, or we're just people who want to consume something and have a good time. So let's treat each other well. Another thing that you can do is create larger in-groups. So basically, this is creating the us and them, the 2 different groups, creating a we. Okay? This is where I love to talk about and write about the University of Nebraska because of what they've done and the administration has done. So this is the Heroes Trophy, the Heroes Game Trophy. And everyone knows what the Heroes Game Trophy is, I'm sure. But it's every year a citizen from the state of Nebraska and a citizen from the state of Iowa are acknowledged for what they consider heroic acts, right? I went to the first Heroes game, and the one citizen was a former law enforcement officer. One citizen was a former military officer who saved children. And what that does is for that 5 minutes or 7-minute presentation at halftime, Iowa fans and Nebraska fans aren't yelling at each other, right? They can at least support some common good. I remember that game very well because I was filming the kickoff, and 2 people from Iowa sitting behind me or supporting Iowa wanted to be funny, and they yelled right into the phone. And so it was really, really loud, obviously in our ears, and into the phone recording. But at halftime, those people aren't acting that way. Because what does it say about us if we can't celebrate something positive as a group? Another great example is the Freedom Trophy. Right? This is University of Nebraska and University of Wisconsin. So we can be us versus them, but we can all support our nation's military. right? At least surrounding that game, or at least during the trophy presentations for that game. So the third thing we do, to steal a line from coaching backgrounds, placing our players and placing our organizations in winning situations. So building from the previous example about mediated stories, organize those positive interactions. Organize blood drives, food drives, and then promote those. Because when something negative happens, and it will, unfortunately, it not only hurts the rival brand, it hurts your brand as well. I had the pleasure of speaking to a group of sports writing students here yesterday, and we talked about this a lot, and saying, you know, as a reporter, as a journalist, you do your job. You report what you need to report, right? If something positive happens, report that. If something negative happens, you're going to report that. That's your job. As an organization, you want to try and put your players, your organization in a winning situation. Now, there is another example from the University of Nebraska, if anybody has seen this. This is the $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy. University of Nebraska and the University of Minnesota. What's so interesting about this, the Heroes game and the Freedom Trophy were born from the administrations at Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, and Nebraska. Whenever I talk to someone about how a rivalry is born or how a rivalry builds, I always say it's based on the fans. You either find out what the fans want, who they consider their rival to be, and you start promoting that, or if you're going to promote it and push it on your own, you find those few stakeholders, the fans that are going to have everybody follow behind them, you get them on board, and then maybe you have a chance to celebrate this or move those rivalries forward. However, this $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy was something born organically. It was born online between a Twitter battle of Faux Pelini and the Golden Gopher official mascot account. Basically, the back and forth went, at some point it was said, whoever wins the game gets $5. If we win the game, I get to break a chair over your head. The other person said, as long as I get to make a trophy out of it. Somebody made a trophy. If we flip that up, so if we showed the bottom side of that chair, there's a $5 bill pasted to it. Okay? Born organically. For a period of about 3 or 4 games, the organization's actually adopted it as well. There are pictures of Minnesota and Nebraska fans, and Nebraska and Minnesota coaches holding up this trophy. More recently, the administrators have taken a step back, their administrations have taken a step back, and they didn't allow it for a period of time, leading the organizers of the $5 Bits of Broken Chair Trophy to now start to raise funds for local charities. So now it's back. So it's for a good cause, right? For charities. However, the name is still Broken Chair, insinuating that you're going to break a chair over someone's head. Now, it brings up a really interesting question. If fans drive rivalries, then administrations can do what they want to try and make something positive, but are fans driven toward the negative? And then it's the chicken or the egg question. Are they driven toward the negative because that's what they see in the media, that's what they see from administrations? Or are administrations and media just trying to give them what they want? So, what's next? From a research perspective, conducting research outside of sport. So this is my job. This is what my job with the students is. Right now, we're analyzing comments made, online comments made during the 2016 presidential debates, and comparing those to the 3 biggest rivalry games in college football in 2016. The results are preliminary, but I think it's probably no surprise. People were much more negative toward the out-group in the political discussion boards than they were on the sport discussion boards. So looking into things like politics, and that's something that Peter and I have talked about as well, trying to look at different ways to measure this. Also looking at different consumer brands. So right now we're running a survey looking at rivalry between Disney and Comcast and those brands, like Disney Parks and Universal Parks. We're about to start one with a grad student that's going to look at Marvel and DC, and Apple, Samsung, and then start to do a better job of discussing what people or what sport can teach us about rivalry. So within the last year and a half, that's what I've started to write more about. That's what I've started to talk more about. Typically, we take theories from outside of sport and apply them to sport. Now we have all of this information about what this competition aspect and what these loyal fans and avid fans, how they feel toward each other. Can we now share that with other people and maybe tell them or give them some guidance as to what to expect? What's next on our website? So we're coming out with our third series of our podcast. So the first two series were This Week in Rivalry. Our series that's premiering this next Friday, March 15th. I'm actually working with a sports writing class at the University of Memphis, and they are choosing their title as Rivalries Ranked. So they're going to have a long format, a seasoned podcast where they're going to talk about the top 3 rivalries in the NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball. They're going to have 7 weeks of that. And that's something that's really cool. That's student driven. The picture up here is one of my graduate students who is kind of over this. She has taken the reins as far as working with the students on the website, letting them know what to do, having them be accountable for that. Another thing that we're doing, this is another undergraduate student. He's one of our honors students at the university. He's creating a documentary called A Closer Look at Sport Rivalry, where he's a sports journalist, or he's a journalism student, journalism major. He was interested in doing documentaries. He wanted to see if that's something he wanted to pursue. So we got in touch, and now he is in the final stages of developing this documentary. So thank you to Megan and Nathan for their work. The other thing, with the comics, we have the historical comics, but we also have ones called Adventures with Sport Rivalry Man. So we started looking at, hey, can we use this superhero genre to teach positive lessons and put people in situations where basically it says, just because someone wears a different shirt than you do or supports a different team doesn't mean they're that different. You should treat them in a positive manner. So the 3 that we have up here, we have, I think, 13 or 14 now. There's one on online bullying, something that happens to kids all the time. There's one on being the new kid at school and being accepted in school. There's one on being able to watch the game at the same watch party as a rival team. And so obviously, these are moral stories that we're trying to teach about behavior. And we focus these toward kids, toward school kids, for a few reasons that I'll get into. We developed a curriculum around this to help these kids with the objectives of, 1, to teach about in-group bias and about rivalry and why things happen the way they do, why we feel differently than the way we do, or towards someone else. We also want to provide examples of appropriate behavior. So just because this person is a fan of your rival team doesn't mean you shouldn't help them after the game if they're in a situation, right? Some of our goals. Kids are really good at taking something out of one context and putting it into another context. Our hope is, through these stories and through this curriculum, we can actually have students take these lessons out of the sports setting and they can put them into another setting. So maybe when they're at school and they see a kid maybe who's not eating lunch with the rest of the kids, and it has nothing to do with sport, but maybe they can say, well, I want that kid to eat with me. Or if they have a disagreement with someone, they don't have to throw down their hands and kick their feet and say, you're wrong and you're a bad person for believing that, as unfortunately adults do. Maybe they can see through that and they can take these stories and these lessons outside of that context. Finally, hopefully, or the goal, maybe the student becomes the teacher. Adults don't always set the right examples, do we? Especially involving something with an in-group and an out-group. Maybe kids could actually start to talk to their parents, talk to adults about the proper way to behave towards someone who may be different from themselves. For this reason, we've actually started to change the way we tell these stories. It used to be Sport Rivalry Man, this guy here up at the top, was sort of the Jiminy Cricket character, and he would tell people the right way to behave. He would be the conscience, and they would make a decision, he would tell them that's not nice, they would change the way they behave. Now, we've started to write stories that are more empowering to kids. The kids are the ones making the decisions. The kids are the ones that are actually making the change. Sport Rivalry Man exists just in the background only. So this summer, we're working on curriculum training, and we're working on funding to print more of the comics. If anyone's interested in looking, I have some comics with me that you can look at, but we're interested in printing more of those, but we're interested in the curriculum training as well. So having students go out and teach these lessons in community centers around our community and in other communities. And then we've even tossed around the idea of, or I've tossed around the idea of writing different children's books and young readers' books to have just another way, another tool to add to the thousands of tools out there to help kids realize this isn't the way they have to behave just because other people say they should behave that way. So that's all that I have. I know we have a few minutes. I welcome any questions, any advice, any ideas for future study.
50 years ago, when the great novelist James Michener was writing his historical fiction series, he stepped back once and wrote a very obscure book called Sports in America. You probably would find it very interesting to go back and read Michener's book, because there are several chapters on sports and rivalries, and compare his findings and conclusions with your now 50-year later updated research.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great idea. Thank you. Anyone else?
I was going to say, I think your last ideas where you're talking about kids and using graphics and cartoons, I think that's really right on the money. And I hope that the journalism students go talk to some of the family students or the child development students or the psych students who, just as these students are studying rivalries, they study things like bullying, or they study things like really how you can negotiate with kids across cultural lines or economic lines or whatever it is. So it would be great to have that kind of multidisciplinary work. We talk all the time in the academy about how valuable it is, but we often kind of keep in our own path.
Definitely.
So I just think you've really got some really neat ideas there. And as somebody in child development myself, I would say, hey, I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to have our students talk to your students.
Well, thank you very much.
That would be-
I'd like to put a plug in. Marjorie has a splendid article in the Marjorie has a great, splendid article in the Great Plains Research that just came out today. So she knows what she speaks of. But so do you. I mean, you're reaching out to all sorts. So that's a shameless plug for the journal. It's cross-disciplinary at its best. But thank you, Marjorie.
No worries. I would love to do that. I would love to speak to more people.
That'd be great, because I just think you found a channel to youth, and you found a way that youth can really be empowered and can be the teacher. And I think that's something to nurture.
Well, thank you. And so what we were wanting with this is really three things. We want to use, can we use something like sport? It's generally interesting to people, a lot of people, kids in particular. Can we use the superhero genre? And if you have any questions about how popular that is, go watch the lines forming for Captain Marvel right now. That's going to open Friday, right? And then can we use comics? Because we did a lot of reading about the use of comics in education at both the elementary level or grade school level and even at the college level. And then one more thing on that, this past October, I got to go to a conference where it was outside of sport management. It was in more social sciences. And so I actually did get to speak to people in disability services, and somebody brought up the idea, hey, maybe something like this would be helpful for if you had a character who had a disability, who had to live with that, and maybe helping other kids see how to properly treat someone. So thank you very much.
Well, I think we're aware in Nebraska that we constantly get complimented on our fan behavior. And I just wondered, do you have any idea how that came about? And do any other schools think about this? I mean, is this something that administrators in different colleges and universities ever think about and want to have this reputation for their fans being good sports?
I think, to answer your first question, I think a lot comes from when we talk about identity, when we talk about what you want to be representative of yourself. If you want someone, or if you want to be seen as a hard worker, or as someone who is honest or loyal or something, like, you're going to choose teams that, display those type of characteristics. And the state as a whole, there's a great book by Aiden, A-I-D-E-N, where he talks about Nebraska football and really what it means to be a Nebraska football fan. And he uses football as the context, but it's about the state and about what it means to be a homesteader, what it means to have home, what it means to help people. And I think a lot of it comes from that's something that's another reason I love writing about and talking about the University of Nebraska, because it is very unique in a number of ways. And the state of Nebraska is unique in a number of ways. From a sport perspective, there really is one major football university here, right? So I know there's Creighton and there's smaller schools that play other, Creighton's really good in basketball, but when you could be in the northwest portion of the state, someone who's never been to Lincoln, but they love the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and they want to emulate what Nebraska or what the Cornhuskers do. They also want the team to emulate what they do. And so when that's something that earlier we talked about, cutting off reflected success. When the team does something that you don't agree with, maybe they're in a cheating scandal, or they get a few players get in trouble that you don't agree with. Maybe you push away from the organization. I think that is something that's very beautiful here. I think it comes from the state as much as the organization. To answer your second question, there are athletics departments and organizations who would like to at least, they want visiting fans to have a good time. If for no other reason, they want people to come back, right? One example I'll give is following the 2005 game between the Texas Longhorns and the Ohio State Buckeyes in Columbus. There were reports of Texas alumni walking back to their cars and having objects thrown at them. What did Texas do as a result? Well, Texas started about a $2 or $2.5 million advertising campaign about being classy. And I can't remember the exact slogan, but it was all built up to when Ohio State comes to Austin to play. They didn't want to have those type of behaviors because Ohio State got a lot of negative press from that. And so I think organizations do try to emulate the ones that are doing things the right way. If for no other reason, you want people to come back and you want people to have a good time, right? Thank you.
All right.